Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming back for the second day of our 8th Annual Deming Users Group Conference. It's nice to see all these faces here this morning. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today two very special people and very good friends of OQPF and myself, Peter Scholtes and Mary Jenkins. Peter Scholtes is an internationally recognized author, lecturer, and independent consultant. His background is in organizational development, and he has over 30 years' experience in planning and implementing change in all types of organizations. Through 1993, Peter taught with Dr. Deming as one of the instructors of Dr. Deming's popular two-day seminars. Peter works with top management to plan, coordinate, and oversee applications of quality management principles in their organizations. The cornerstone of his work is educating managers on the theory, skill, methods, and tools needed to guide the efforts of their employees. In recent years, Peter's become a recognized authority on how to incorporate a quality philosophy in human resource systems. He is also the principal author of the Team Handbook, which has sold over 600,000 copies worldwide. We are also happy to say that Peter is a member of the newly formed Advisory Council to the OQPF Board. Mary Jenkins is a human resource consultant and vice president of Drake Beam Morin Incorporated Training and Consulting. She has over 18 years' experience developing and implementing systems in large organizations. She is recognized as an authority on how to incorporate a quality philosophy in the human resource systems, and is an instructor for OQPF and Michigan State University management programs. Prior to becoming a consultant, Mary was the Director of Human Resources for GM Powertrain Division. She was fortunate to serve under the tutelage of Dr. Deming for 7 years and has led several teams in the redesign of their human resource systems. Their talk today will be about human resources in the post-Deming era. Please join me in welcoming Peter.
Thanks, Phyllis. It's nice to be here. When I told my wife I was giving a talk with the title, Human Resources in the Post-Deming Era, she said, well, that shouldn't be too hard. He's only been dead a few months. Everybody's a comedian. We're gonna, if you'll turn to your notes, there's a page kind of, I don't know what to call it. It's like 3 eyes. And you'll notice that's sort of the table of contents, and it's also about the same as our agenda, which is on the previous page. And you'll notice the first part of what we're going to be doing includes the basics of an organization, a systems view of work, and then and under that some subtitles. And then there's another section of the notes with 2.1 and the following, where we have some specific human resource activities and points of focus. So that we're going to give some kind of conceptual overviews based heavily on Dr. Deming's theory of profound knowledge. And then we're going to talk about some of the implications for human resources and then some of the specific activities that we think will be different as a result of that. I will, do you want to say anything? You want to say hello? Let them know you're here.
The only other thing I can think of, Peter, is that it strikes me that we have a setup here that for some of you might be remarkably familiar to last night. I don't know how many of you, other than these people in the front row who are hungover, went to the Full Moon Saloon and saw the dueling pianos. Today we're going to kind of carry on that theme, and we'll have dueling overhead projectors, so that when this one goes on, we'd like all of you to stand, and the same on the other side. We'll just keep this going back and forth. Yep. Our closest is we're going to get to entertainment.
Right. If all else fails, entertain. So let's talk about some basics of the organization and a systems view of work. Sometimes when I try to figure out what's going on in life, I try to boil things down to their absolute simplest. And this is my absolute simplest when it comes to an organization. This is true of all organizations. This is true of your bowling club. It's true of any kind of social organization or work-related organization. It consists of an aggregate of people who are pursuing some goal by means of some kind of method or system or process. And you can't get much more simple than that. But I think in the simplicity of this basics of an organization, we can find out a lot of things that are going wrong. That some of the errors in the past are errors with regard to people in organizations. We attribute all wrongs to people problems, operator error, dereliction of duty. The traditional organizational chart was an attempt to divide up the human population of an organization and attribute to them each of them areas of accountability. So when something goes wrong, we know who screwed up. That's the basic purpose of the classic organizational chart. We also try to develop solutions to problems that are really people solutions to problems. And we do things like reorganization. Empowerment for me is an intervention with the people when the problem may not be with the people. We tried motivational programs. The basic problem is that our people aren't motivated, so we as managers must motivate our people. Behavior modification, etc. And then the errors with regard to the systems, the method by which we achieve our goals is, for the most part, disregarding their existence. We pretend like there are no systems. Everything's okay if you just do your job without any advertence to the systems and the importance of the systems in getting work done. Also, the ignorance of variation and other process characteristics. And we confuse systems capability with human effort. That's I think, the single biggest mistake that we make in running our organizations, that we think that everything's okay if people would just do what they're supposed to do. And then some mistakes we make with regard to purpose is work not worth doing in the first place. As Frederick Hertzberg says, a job not worth doing is not worth doing well. And also we have purposes aimed largely at self-aggrandizement. I get worried when I see organizations whose business is mostly to make deals. If the purpose of the organization is to make deals rather than deliver services or products, that means that the customer of the deal-making business is the business itself and the owners of the business. And there's no altruism in the organization. There's nothing that has people looking outward. And so if the top of the organization exists for the sake of its own self-aggrandizement, then the message that gets sent throughout the organization is that that's what we all should pursue, is the self-aggrandizement, the great American incentive system, as we have heard referred to. Also, the problems with purposes are purposes that are constantly shifting, no constancy of purpose. Purposes that are attached to people rather than the core values of the organization, so that when the people leave, the purpose is gone with them. And also the purpose of the organization being subverted by hidden agendas or personal agendas within the organization. I think we've all experienced what it means to have our purposes undone. Let me give you a couple examples. These aren't in your notes. By and large, everything that will be on the screen will be in your notes if you can't read it. But these both you won't be able to read, and they aren't in your notes. It's life. Life isn't fair. But at least you could probably read the headlines here. It has to do with a police scandal in Washington, D.C. These are photocopies of the Washington Post. And these are two stories that were together in the paper. This is a story that was unfolding the whole week that I happened to be in Washington when this is going on. It has to do with a police corruption case where they had police officers, a ring of police officers, it turns out 12 of them, who were involved in the selling of drugs. And they were trying to find out what caused this problem. Well, they weren't trying real hard. They just figured if we just fire these corrupt police officers, things would be okay. But the more they dug into the case, they found out that in 1989 and 1990, there was a whole lot of federal money available for hiring police officers, similar perhaps to what's existing in the current controversial crime bill. A lot of money to hire a lot of officers and put them on the streets, but there was a pretty severe time deadline for doing that hiring. So they rushed through a hiring process, and instead of the ordinary 3 months of background checking that they usually did, they tried to do it in 2 weeks, and they tried to do it in 2 weeks for a considerably larger number of candidates. As a result, they ended up, in fact, hiring police officers One police officer, I think I remember hearing, was in a halfway house when he was hired. Police officers with felony records. So that it should have not been a surprise that all of the officers that were arrested for corruption were from that same class. As an example where it's not excusing the behavior of the police officers, but underneath that scandal was in fact a systems problem where they didn't do the background checks at all. The other story has to do with General Electric. These are two headlines also from the USA Today, which is my favorite source of statistics, but here it's a news story. And the front page story was about the CEO, Welch, feeling terribly embarrassed and bemoaning this terrible scandal that took place in their Kidder Peabody subsidiary. And then turned out it was this one investment counselor who was overly aggressive, and he did some paperwork shenanigans to make phony profits look like real profits, and it ended up with a big scandal and a terrible financial loss for GE. And this guy eventually got fired, but this story told some things that were interesting. You probably can't read it on the screen, but right about here it says his compensation was based on his performance as a bond trader. They had a whole compensation and evaluation system that depended on them being aggressive and showing profits and so forth, and he did exactly what was expected of him. Now, maybe it wasn't expected of him that he do unethical things, but there was an environment, a pressure built up to do things. And we can find all sorts of examples of this. Sears Roebuck cheating its auto repair customers, selling them parts they didn't need and repairs that they didn't need, simply because there was an evaluation system at work that caused people to cut corners. So it's an example of us displacing external focus and pleasing the customer with these internal goals, which almost necessarily involve in these distortions. I want to say something here about the interdependence of systems and teamwork. What they all have in common is purpose. Dr. Deming used to emphasize that without a purpose there was no system. Well, it seems to me also without a purpose there's no team. It's the purpose that decides what the team is, what the team should be, what the composition of the team should be, what the methods of the team should be, and so forth, and how the team interacts, and how the team defines whether it's successful or not, is based on purpose. It's the purpose that brings them together and holds the team together. Similarly, without a system or a method, the team cannot succeed. Also, I believe that a system without teamwork, whether it's in a broader sense of teamwork or without small groups of people, sometimes small groups of people working collaboratively with each other, there's no system. So there's this interdependence. Without a purpose, there's no system. Without teamwork, there's no system. Without purpose, there's no teamwork. Without systems, there's no teamwork. The three are intertwined. And I think that's part of sort of a subset of the system of profound knowledge that Dr. Deming left us as part of his legacy. So a systems view of work. What do we mean by a systems view of work? This is the classic CPOC model: suppliers, input, process, output, customers. So everything from a massive organization to a small method, everything from the worldwide Pizza Hut chain can be described in this sequence of interdependent activities that leads to something that goes to the customers, to the making of a single pizza. Even the making of just the pizza dough can be described as the suppliers, the input, the process, the output, and the customers, those who benefit from the making of that. So it can describe macro operations, micro operations, and what they all have in common is that this flow of interdependence. And this is an important concept for understanding some of the refinements in the view of human resources. Let me, for instance, give this quick example. The hiring system. If the hiring system is indeed a system, that means it's got some antecedents and some consequences. And what would you say was the starting point of a hiring system? Just a single act of hiring. Anybody want to venture a guess? Yeah. determine the kind of person you want to hire for the particular job that's open? Okay. And what would the end of the hiring process be? Hiring that person. Okay. Now let's say that the hiring process begins before what you said, before the determining the needs. What might it be if it started before that? Sorry? The creation of the job. Let's say it starts before that. I'm sorry? The needs of the organization based on the aim. Yeah. I mean, the point is that you can always say that our traditional starting points for anything are almost always long after some of the real starting point. It seems to me, for instance, when you're in a community hiring employees, from the candidate's point of view, the starting point of that system is what are the things that have been happening over the years to give people an impression of your organization that helps them to decide, do they want a job with you or not? Whether you're an attractive potential employer or not. And cannot the Human Resource Department think of its responsibilities with the hiring process of working even before that and working to help the community come to the conclusion that not just on the basis of salary ranges, but on other bases, that this is a good place to work. That one might conceive of the salary system or the hiring system as long preceding the actual vacancy or position that needs to be described. And afterward, it seems to me that one could legitimately describe the end of the hiring process as being some point where, maybe for the life of the employee, but at least at that point at which the newly hired employee is well integrated and functioning in a stable way in the new position. Rather than just, we hired the person and now it's somebody else's responsibility. Cannot the Human Resource Department see itself as part of that entire sweep of attention and responsibility? So that's a sense, to give you a sense of how a systems point of view, and seeing things not as single events, but as a series of interdependent events, to help systems thinking apply to the Human Resource Department. Okay.
Well, that was fast.
You're ready. You're ready.
I am. Okay, are you ready out there? That's what I was looking for. Oh, well. I guess it works better at 10 o'clock at night than 8 o'clock in the morning.
In a bar.
In a bar with music. What I want to then shift from picking up where Peter has left off is to talk about human resource systems and what their aim is, what the purpose is. And kind of as a prelude to that, the passion that I have around this subject is I don't think there is any discipline that touches the heart or the soul of the company more than the systems that are stewarded by human resources. There are very few that touch everyone and absolutely speak volumes to the workforce as to what you believe about them and what kind of company you are. We've tended to undervalue that. As a matter of fact, if you even reflect on your own experiences, I know mine would suggest that in conversations with the leadership, the vast majority of our time is spent discussing business strategies, product strategies, and very little time, proportionately, is spent understanding the human systems and what kind of systems need to be in place to support or enable the business strategies to take place. The importance, I think, for the first time has been pretty well documented in a book you might want to pick up as you add to your reading list. It's called Corporate Culture and Organizational Performance by John Kotter. And it represents an 11-year study, so we've got a longitudinal study looking at cultures and how they impact the bottom line of the business. And whether you look at whatever measure you want to look at, whether it's profits, employment levels, things that we traditionally view as measures of success for companies, there is a dramatic difference in those companies that have certain attributes within their workforce as compared to more traditional attributes. And many of them are embodied in what you've been studying and learning about in the last couple of days. So that'll be a real good, I think, for those of you who need hard data to look at some of the softer issues as we refer to them. It's something you might want to pick up. So picking up with the aim, and thinking about it in the context of human resources, we need to begin to think about what is our purpose in human resources, or what is our aim. If I teach a course, I think was mentioned through Michigan State University, where it's taking some of the quality principles and beginning to work with human resource professionals on how has their role changed as a result of this. And before we start studying the implications of quality, if I were to ask the group, what do you believe is your purpose? The first answer that comes to mind is to ensure fairness and equity. The second answer that comes from the group, and this is after probably close to 200 to 250 people, the second answer is to protect the company in the event of litigation. Now, if that is what we view to be our purpose, then it follows as you examine some of the systems that are currently in place. But imagine how the role would change if your purpose was to maximize the contribution and the capability of the workers in the organization. How that would dramatically begin to shift what the systems look like, where we spend our time, what kind of skill sets a human resource professional might need to have in order to support its customers. So the purpose has changed very dramatically. Secondly, there's an important word in here that I just want to highlight called stewardship. Another historical view I think we have of our role in human resources is to assume that we own the systems. It's our hiring system, it's our selection system, it's our compensation system, and that whether we implicitly or explicitly demonstrate that is irrelevant. Our behavior certainly would act that out. If we believed, however, that they are not our systems, that we simply act as caretakers on behalf of the organization, again, it begins to shift and change how we work on those systems, who we involve, how we know whether or not we're functioning and providing the kind of services that we need to in the human resources field. One of the critical components then is to understand who our customers are. And a big distinction, another shift in thinking, is to begin to realize that our customers are not the people to whom we are accountable. And I think, I look back again on my history, there is a tendency to view our customers and to respond to predominantly the leadership of a given organization. Now, we could very easily draw an analogy between that behavior and our typical feedback systems, where we have created, implicitly or explicitly, the assumption that our customer is our boss, is our supervisor. That's the person we need to satisfy. In human resources, the people we need to satisfy tend to be the leadership. The shift, again, that this represents as you begin to look at our services from a systems perspective is that the customers are defined by the service or the system, and they may be different from one activity to another. The customers of a benefits system may be very different than the customers of the hiring system. Certainly there is overlap, but the key criteria is the point of application. So when we want to know how our systems are functioning, we don't always get the best answers by going to the leadership and asking them how well their needs are being satisfied. What valuable information you might pick up if you were to go to people who had an opening that they were trying to fill and begin to solicit feedback from them around how well that system has worked for them, how long it took, the quality of candidates they received, etc., trying to match up with their expectations. I'm going to pick and pull a little bit from a page that's, I believe, the next one in your book, trying to point to the difference between, as a result of the shift and change that's taken place, particularly in the quality arena, what kind of gaps have been created between what we do, typically in human resources, and what we probably need to start doing from a quality perspective. So I'm going to just highlight a few of those and let you peruse the rest at your convenience. First one I'd like to point to is, I think we touched on this several times yesterday, but the whole idea that problems that exists, and Peter just talked about that. The problems that we see or exist, we tend to attribute to employee performance problems or a training problem, versus the point Peter was making is beginning to look at problems being rooted in the systems themselves. By way of example, I can think of a municipality in Canada that had an issue that surfaced in their police force. And there's two key understandings or underpinnings that I think are critical to this story. One is that there is a thought process for purposes of safety, that you follow a direct order without hesitation. We see that in the military, we see that in the police ranks. So that's kind of an underpinning to some of the behaviors that we see. The second thing that's critical in terms of understanding a little bit about how they operate is that they have a strong belief that when they go on any kind of call, some kind of problem that they're asked to respond to, that they be in full uniform. And the reason for being in full uniform is to project authority and to distinguish who they are. So those are two underpinnings to this story. And there was a woman who went with her superior officer and was asked to respond to a brawl that was taking place at a bar. And the two of them drove there, they got out of the car, and her superior officer said to her, "Put your hat on." She said, "I can't see when I put my hat on." And he said, "I'm giving you a direct order, put your hat on." She didn't put her hat on. He sent her back and said, "I'll catch up with you later." When he got back to the office, he immediately put her on a 2-week suspension without pay. After thousands of dollars of litigation. The learning that came from that is, as it turns out, the problem of the hat fitting and the impact that had on her ability to see was not limited to her. As a matter of fact, it was a problem of gender, and those hats don't fit the women that were in the police ranks. So it was a systemic issue, a systemic problem that was dealt with as though it was an individual performance issue. We can't lose sight in their case of their two underlying issues of respond when I ask you to for your own safety, and being in full uniform is important. The lesson from this is not to give up on that, but to begin to search out and understand, are there some systems issues that are contributing to a problem you see, as opposed to a dereliction of duty, as Peter pointed out before. There's also a tendency that we have, and part of the reason we're so enamored with pay-for-performance systems, to understand and focus on outstanding performers, good and bad, as opposed to looking at systems that are good or bad. And one of the fallouts from that is, whether we do this consciously or not, we tend to reinforce some behaviors in people who do get the results that we're looking for, but in a way that might cause damage to the larger organization. And we reinforce that that is what we want by the way we reward people. One of the learnings from feedback, again, we're enamored with feedback, but one of the most significant ways to give people feedback or to teach, and if the purpose of feedback is to modify behavior in some way or reinforce behavior, one of the ways that happens most effectively is through observational learning. I watch what you do, and then I observe the consequences of what you've done. And based on those consequences, I'll either attempt to incorporate that in my portfolio of behavior, or I'll watch what happened to you and remark to myself that I'll never do what you just did, depending on the consequences. We really need to think about what messages do we send when we pull people out and assume that what they've accomplished or not accomplished is due to them as opposed to the systems within which they work. Another key point, there tends to be conventionally a distrust or adversarialness in terms of relationships, probably best seen in some of the collective bargaining processes that we're involved in that are very rooted and very difficult to change. We have policy manuals, many of us, that are this thick, that we've written a policy for everything that we've seen in an attempt to try and control behavior. We have very visible signs of distrust, whether it's time clocks or how we get in and out of a facility, as opposed to beginning to develop policies and relationships that reflect an environment of teamwork and trust. It would look very, very different if that's what we were attempting to create. But one of the things that's amazing to me is that this drives so much of what we do, and yet we never see ourselves that way. It's always them. It's always they. Who are they? Who are they that are so different from us that we feel such a need to put policies in place like we have, to assume that we can't work through problems together in a collaborative way, and that we can't allocate and develop resources that would communicate that. The employee as an object of utility, this is your job, this is what I expect you to do, versus an understanding that perhaps they have some input, communicating mutual respect and collaboration. I'd like to share a learning that I picked up from an individual at General Motors who went to Isuzu for about an 18-month assignment. And his intent in going there was to study production systems, but he came back with a learning that, from a human resources perspective, I'll never forget. And he described a conversation that he had with some of the people there, trying to understand the cultural differences or the way they manage in contrast to the way we manage. And it was suggested to him, when they observe how we manage people in this country, if this is the total amount of work to be done, we have a tendency to take that and to break it into very definable, explicit components and hope that collectively we have defined the total work to be done. You can think of these as job descriptions. He said, in contrast, what he observed was, looking at that same work, a tendency to identify lead responsibilities that people would have with intentional gaps, a lot of gray area. And what did that communicate? What's the difference in the message? Did I expect you? There's an expectation of stretching beyond what I've defined. What have we created? What is the mental response, the verbal response that we've created through this type of system? What kinds of things have you heard people say? It's not my job. But it's not their job because that's the way we've trained people to think. So another implication, I think, of looking at work from a systems perspective is to be able to shift from this to this. There's some pretty powerful learnings there. We tend to, in human resources, or have tended to, and by the way, I realize these are written in pretty extreme terms and that most of us are beginning to move in a different direction. But if you look at a lot of the systems that are in place, they were designed to suit our own purposes. I'm going to share a visual with you in just a minute of what that might look like, as opposed to designing them in collaboration with the people that will be affected by those systems. We have a one-size-fits-all response to some of our problems. I think of, again, feedback systems. Isn't it amazing that the assumption that we make in most of the feedback systems we have is that we all have identical needs in terms of feedback? That's why we set them up so it's June, it's your service date, it's time for feedback. You must need it because it's been 1 year since we had it the last time. In fact, our need for feedback is highly variable, and some of the factors that contribute to that have to do with the nature of the work itself. Sometimes we have work that doesn't cycle annually. It could cycle more frequently, it could cycle in longer periods of time because it's more project-oriented. It's not an ideal time to stop once a year and provide feedback. We are at very different places in our lives. People who are right out of school have very different needs for feedback than those who are nearing the end of their career. And yet we force people through the same hoops, assuming that they need the same thing. Another anecdote I can think of around one-size-fits-all is, see if you recognize yourself in anything remotely close to this story. I was working with a law firm that had a flexible policy relative to lunch. You could just kind of come and go when you needed to. And as it turns out, there was one person in that office who abused that, who tended to stretch the lunch break. The response to that was to have a system where you had to sign in and sign out, put your time down for when you left, your time down for when you came back, and it was laid across the entire workforce, the entire administrative support workforce. That's another important distinction. Now, can you imagine what the reaction was to that? And what does that cause people to do? When you begin to tell people, I don't trust you, that I need to control you, to have you do what it is I want you to do, isn't it likely that we actually create the very behavior we're trying to avoid? Let me move on here, too. Peter, I'm probably going on and on too long. Let me just quickly hit on this issue of speed and responsiveness versus red tape. Some of the systems that we have taking a very long time to respond to the needs of our customers. I want to share a visual with you, knowing full well that this is worse than what Peter put up there. I can't even read it standing here next to it, so it's not up here for you to be able to read, but to just get a sense of the visual impact. This is a selection system. This is how it works visually. I'll just point out there are 72 steps in this process. The likelihood of having to get down to a certain point and loop back and start over is very high. And if you were a manager trying to fill an opening, what would you do? My sense is, and my experience is, that the chances are you're going to figure out a way to circumvent that system and to fill your opening. So one of the best places to look for where are you missing satisfying your customers is to examine which systems or processes do you have in place that seem to be circumvented over and over and over again. It might be a real good place to start in terms of taking another look at them. I want to leave you with a model. And the model is to begin to frame how well we're doing in terms of meeting our customer needs, and to compare that with how important it is. So think of this in terms of how close or how your customers value this particular service. And you can think of this axis as getting a sense of when you've defined what your process characteristics are, how well are you doing? How close are you coming to satisfying their needs? Let me build this up for you just a little bit. The backdrop to all of this, and there's not time to share it, would be a survey instrument that was directed at the right customers that allowed you to pull feedback together and examine how you're doing to help you target what your next steps might be. You're going to see in that matrix that I just had up there an opportunity to plot data in this fashion. Oh, Peter, I did it. I tried so hard not to write on these. Oh, well. You're going to see an opportunity to visually create a focus of where should you be spending your time. And then I'm going to start and take you through quadrant by quadrant what some strategies or thoughts might be that you could consider. Starting with, suppose that you get some feedback that lands up in this quadrant. I would consider that something that you would think about needing to develop. So if you were going to label that quadrant, it would be called develop in terms of what you need to do. And then some thoughts you might consider around why you're doing that or why you're not doing that would be whether or not you're capable of addressing that need that's so critical to your customer. Is it an expertise that you don't have readily available? And if not, what might be some strategies to gain that expertise? Is it simply a question of concentrating effort? Sometimes that's really the root problem. Or is there some type of invention required, which might require a different kind of skill set again? Is it possible that one of the strategies you could use to satisfy that need is either to collaborate or to leverage resources? I can think of two personal examples where General Motors has done that. And the first is by developing a relationship with Procter & Gamble and of mutual learning, where there's an expertise that Procter & Gamble has that General Motors wants to learn, and there's an expertise that General Motors has that Procter & Gamble wants to learn, and there's some collaboration and information sharing that starts to go on. Another example is General Motors partnering on an equal playing basis in terms of finances with a consulting firm to develop a brand new system around individual growth, because both parties could benefit from that. So there's a lot of strategies you might be able to employ to address the need to develop. The next major quadrant would be this one, which is still very important to customers, but you're doing it pretty well as well. So one of the questions you might consider is are the processes that fall within that quadrant stable enough that you might be able to redeploy people into the development quadrant? There is a tendency in this bottom quadrant, this is where we're not meeting customer needs, but they also don't think that they're that important relative to the other things that need to be addressed. So is there a way we can be satisfied rather than deploying resources into this area to meet minimum requirements so that we can again shift into the area where we're falling considerably short? And so that would be a strategy again of where you might direct resources. And finally, in the bottom right quadrant, this is an area that if you were going to label it, it might be overperformed. This is an area that's not very important to your customers, relatively speaking, but boy, do we do it well. So the questions you might ask is there any risk in reducing the amount of effort that you spend in that area? Is it a system or process that could be outsourced, or could technology be applied? So again, you can begin to shift your resources up to the area that needs to be addressed in the development arena. Some outcomes from beginning to look at our work that way should be to help you focus on what needs our immediate attention. Relatively speaking, we tend to think everything's important, but what really needs our immediate attention? Is there anything that we're doing that we are overperforming, and is it possible that that's rooted in an old aim, an old purpose of human resources? And is there a capability gap in terms of skill that we need to begin to identify and develop inside of our companies? Some strategies for developing that and beginning to fill that gap would be retraining, simply taking your existing resources and having a well thought out plan to begin to move the skills. As opportunities present themselves for recruiting, to do very focused recruiting of people who have the skill sets that you need in order to flesh out that development area. To forge partnerships or alliances. It's amazing what could be done if we could collaborate cross-company. Many of us, particularly in this room, are working on very similar issues. And can resources actually be leveraged from other areas within your company where the skills might reside? Or just some quick things for you to begin to think about in order to move in the area that needs to be addressed. Dual.
Okay. We realized beforehand that it's always tempting to write on the overheads, and we realized, though, that we have a break and then we do this presentation again. So we said we can't write on the overheads, otherwise we have to, Dr. Deming style, lick a napkin and wipe it off. So she did it.
I know. You can lick it.
I know how you're going to spend your break. Section 2, there's a second section in your notes, and we're going to take a real quick skip through these. They consist of a number of individual kinds of HR-type services, and we just want to make a few comments on them. On page 2-4, or 2-3 and 2-4 are a kind of a summarized two-page version of some of these same things. And then each of those is taken with a little bit more detail separately. So we're going to go through these one at a time, and again, we're going to do this in tandem. Mary's going to start with some comments on employee growth.
Employee growth is listed in those activities as though it were separate, and to some degree that may be the appropriate thing to do. I would also point out, though, that some of the underlying principles that drive individual growth certainly need to be recognized and contemplated in some of the other systems that you'll see listed there, like career development systems, feedback systems. There are very clear implications around how we grow and develop that need to be understood in a number of different arenas. These are some of the learnings, and I've got to say I'm not smart enough to think of this on my own. This is very much, particularly in the area of individual growth, learnings that come from the collaboration between General Motors and Drake, Beam, and Morin. that really embarked on trying to understand if our aim or purpose in a feedback system is to help people grow and improve, then what would be the conditions under which that would happen? The net result of that was a system that we would call an individual growth strategy, and these are the underlying components of that. Self-knowledge. One of the things we've learned as we've examined why our systems don't work is really a behavior that has resulted from the systems that have been in place for a long time, and that is many of us have forgotten what it is that gives us joy in work. We have learned to say that what we want is a given job, because that's what we're supposed to say. We've also learned to respond with words that are very much focused on extrinsic rewards, because that's what we've taught people to do. So when we turn around now and in this new arena ask people to work on what they like to do, we forgot. So one of the important components is to have a system that supports learning about interests and skills, and then allowing for an ability to create greater alignment between the work you do and the knowledge that you have about yourself. And then, of course, that leads into being able to optimize the skills you have. As we move away from that model of very much cookie-cutter approach to job descriptions, we're moving towards teams where there's an opportunity to actually allow each of us to maximize what we do well. And it means that even as you begin to select someone for a team, that you would seek out people who had skills that might be absent from the team. So you could actually have very similar jobs in terms of job description, focusing on different skill sets. There's a need to understand that we work in networks, that systems or key responsibilities that we have connect us to people who might be very different from one set of responsibilities that we have to another set of responsibilities. So we need to make sure that we're aware of that and take advantage of it. And the evolution towards a partnership role, trying to break the mindset that, and this I think is pretty deeply rooted as well, that my development is the responsibility of my manager. Or another deeply rooted assumption is that it is possible to develop a computer system that out of 10,000 people will pick the one person that is best suited for a given opening. That is kind of the undercurrent of some of the conversations we have with our employees. And in fact, what we need to do is have people much more active in defining what their needs are, what kinds of jobs they might have in the future. And of course, buried in that is a lot more flexibility in how work gets done and how do we define jobs.
The second unbundled service has to do with employee feedback. And as I think about employee feedback, from an individual employee's point of view, there's probably two arenas of feedback that are important. One is feedback on me as an individual. How am I doing? A lot of people want to have that. And it seems to me that we ought to be careful about how we do this. Not everybody is ready for it. Feedback ought to be for the purpose of improvement, not for the purpose of control or showing how much smarter you are than the person that you're giving feedback to. And one of the things I admire about what General Motors had developed is a certain self-governance around the feedback process. I get feedback from whom I want feedback when I am ready for feedback around the subjects that I choose to get feedback on. It seems to me that element ought to be part of the individual feedback process, a certain amount of self-control and governance over that. Not to assume that everybody should get feedback when the company decides to give them feedback. Here I'm talking about feedback with regard, and make clear on this, I'm talking about that feedback that has to do with me personally, that I should have control over whether or not I get that. There's another area of feedback that is important to me, and this I would not make optional. This is the area of feedback that comes from the voice of the process and the voice of the customers. There's a picture of this kind of feedback, an attempt to picture this kind of feedback on page 13, 2-13. And in this kind of feedback, whether I'm working within the context of a system, a sequence of activities, and whether I'm an individual or part of a group, as this picture shows here, if we focus on this middle step of the process, there should be continuing feedback from The next step of the process are from the outside customers. So the inside or outside customers identify the key quality characteristics. I sit down with them as their supplier and work out what are the things that are important to them, what do they need that they're not getting, what are they getting that they don't need from me or from us as a step in the process. We identify ways to monitor that data, and that's a continuous source of feedback, because with that feedback we can find out whether our systems are in control, whether they're working, and whether we're pleasing our customers. Meanwhile, we monitor our processes. If it's a mechanical process, what the key process indicators are, what are some of the things that tell us that the process is going as it should go, if it's going to deliver what we expect it to deliver, the kind of vital signs that this process is functioning well. That's another source of feedback. So we have one source of feedback from our customers, another source of feedback from our process, and then we in turn are involved in another feedback loop, which is giving feedback to our internal suppliers or external suppliers on the things that are important. Are we getting what we need from them? Do we need what we're getting from them? So that the feedback process ought to be this succession of feedback loops that are based on data indicating whether the process is working well. It's very different from feedback that I get on as an individual. Gee, I like your tie, Scholtes. That's irrelevant to the work process, and the personal dimension of feedback ought to be at my discretion. I ought to have maximum control over that. And that ought to take place informally on an ongoing way as it's needed. The more teamwork develops, the more freedom there is to share this kind of information that will help people and challenge people to do better. But again, it ought to be voluntary more than obligatory. And most of what we call feedback systems indeed are not feedback systems. Feedback is a systems word, and it refers to a following part of the process, giving feedback to an antecedent part of the process. Most of our feedback systems are indeed feed-down systems. They are when supervisors tell subordinates stuff. Or as Peter Block says, it's that occasion when once a year you find out who owns you. Another thing we're going to talk about is the career development system. Mary.
You can tell we're trying to flip through this fairly quickly. We do want to leave time at the end for you to ask your specific questions. The career development systems arena, and there'll be some materials in there for you to look at this in a lot more detail. I'll just kind of touch on, I think, some key points. This arena is vastly changing. We are out of now the predictable environment of being able to determine which key jobs do I need to have to get where I want to go. That seems to be gone for a lot of reasons, not all to do with the quality movement, a lot to do with the changing structure and evolution of companies. As they downsize, as they flatten, as they broaden spans of control and responsibilities, what we have defined as growth and development has always been focused vertically, and it seems to be moving much more this way. So there is a lot of work, I believe, that needs to be done that contemplates that. And I don't think there has been enough that we can even begin to rework this. So rooted in all of the work around career development systems is understanding the changing nature of organizations themselves. Added to that, as a job opening occurs down the road, if you thread together what we said in terms of teamwork and making selections to round out teams, a selection in year one, the right person for the right job may be very different than if that same job were to open up 5 years from now. Again, recognizing the composition of the team. There are some, again, materials in your book that looks at this issue and also looks at it from another way growth can take place in a more predictable sense.
One of the things that I really admire about General Motors' approach to career development is that to get rid of the assumption that every employee wants to develop their careers or should want to. There are some people who are at a stage in life when that's not their highest priority, and they're perfectly content to stay where they are, and we should not have a prejudice against those people or an expectation that they should want to develop their careers. So that too should be an option that people have. I engage in stuff called career development when I'm at a time in life when that's important to me. But if I'm 6 months away from retirement, I'm probably not interested in career development. Or if I have 4 kids at home, or something like that. Succession. I want to talk about succession systems. How do we prepare for vacancies in the organization? And here, this too is changing rapidly. Partly because of the quality movement, partly because, when Dr. Deming's famous quote, "Let's make toast American style, you burn, I'll scrape." As we improve our systems, we're getting rid of the toast scrapers who, unfortunately, were largely middle management positions. We call them expediters or troubleshooters, or that's just the nature of the job. Well, what happens when you need less of that? The organization flattens, not in the dumb way that we've done it so often in this country where we just arbitrarily flatten the organization before we're ready to, but a legitimate earned flattening of the organization, which means there will be fewer positions available. So with regard to the whole business of filling vacant positions and preparing managers, there's 2 things we need to think of, and they're almost contradictory. One of them is, let's stop thinking about the climbing the ladder of the hierarchy as something that's going to be available for people to aspire to. There's going to be less and less of that. So how can we begin thinking about a flat organization culture? How can we start thinking about leadership as not so much a position that you get promoted into, but more as a function that you from time to time pick up and carry through on, and then leave off and somebody else will pick it up. That's one possible way to exercise leadership, as a shared function that comes and goes rather than a fixed position. And indeed, the jobs that we call management jobs are really a collection of functions that sometimes are ad hoc temporary functions, sometimes they're ongoing functions. But are there ways to share that? We have to think in terms of the salary scale that isn't dependent. The people can make more money through ways other than rising up and through the hierarchy, because there aren't going to be the opportunities to rise up through the hierarchy. So this has all got to be thought through. It seems to me that the implications are pretty profound. And there are going to be positions, presumably, in the organizational chart, and we have to find ways of developing a strong bench. We sometimes act, it seems to me in some countries, in some companies, we sometimes act surprised whenever there's a vacancy in a management position, as though we didn't anticipate it. But most of those vacancies in management positions, in fact, can be anticipated, either because we know somebody's going to retire, or we could probably have some data on how often those vacancies occur so that we can make some predictions about how often, how many times a year are we going to need to fill a management position, and start getting folks ready for those. The worst way to promote into entry-level management positions is through interviews, or through performance appraisal, or any of those things that are not very bright ways to approach the filling of a position. The best way to fill a position is with data, observational data from ad hoc experiences, temporary assignments, and so forth, in which people have had a chance to exercise with a great deal of organizational support so they can be successful, exercise some of the activities that would be characteristic of the yet to open up managerial position. So that when you have a vacancy in a management position, the ideal is to have a lot of people who with experience in that kind of work, and you still end up having a judgment to make, but at least it's a judgment based on experiential data, not on guesswork and how well somebody performs in an interview. So mostly what I'm saying is we have to rethink the whole business of our accession system and our accession planning.
The next major area is compensation, and we're often asked the question: if you don't have a pay-for-performance system, then what might you do? So this is an intended answer to that question. Again, a lot of work to be done, and many companies that have already started to do that. Just by way of process, the first point in that process would really be to understand the jobs themselves. Many of the systems we have in place are not an accurate reflection of the actual work that people do, the skills that it takes for that job to be done, and again, the expansion of responsibilities that have occurred as organizations have changed in terms of structure. So embodied in this is an assumption that there's a lot of work going on to understand and to properly reflect the skills and the responsibilities that someone would have. Secondly, you would develop networks of comparables, a place to go to compare the types of work that take place in your organization, compare that to what people would get on the outside market. You might also even consider allowing employees to suggest what some of the comparables might be, what companies have jobs that are similar to the ones that they possess. It's particularly true as new skill sets and jobs begin to evolve. I can think of when Powertrain, General Motors, began to use statisticians in a very, very different way than what is reflected in a traditional job description. It was very critical that we understood the difference in skills and tried to find a place that was an appropriate reflection to benchmark and know that we were paying them a fair wage. The objective of this is not to excite people about pay. I don't know of any company where people are very excited about pay unless they're all getting lots of money all the time. But our objective, and an objective that I think is admirable in terms of shifting our attention, is to create a neutral position so that people aren't expending energy talking about how unfair it is, which really means eliminating a lot of the arbitrary nature of how we determine pay. You then would monitor the movement in the market to make sure that you keep track of that. Some jobs, some skills move at a more rapid pace than others, and that has to do with skill shortages that might exist. And then to review it annually and make appropriate adjustments. Again, the objective of this system is to make sure people are being paid at a rate of pay that would be commensurate with what they would get if they were to go on the outside.
The next area is team development. And here I want to describe something that I'm not sure exists anywhere. But I want to challenge HR departments to think in these terms. Clearly, teamwork is an important element of our current organizations. Teamwork, the knowledge of the importance of teamwork has been around for some 50 years. That's not new. As a formal study for 50 years, it's probably been around forever as an informal field of study. What I want our organizations to do is to become smarter about teams. There are different kinds of teams, and the notes will delineate some of the different kinds of teams. And the needs of those different kinds of teams are going to be different, and the needs for developing those teams will be different. And what I'd love someone to do is to do some good research on the differences between the different kinds of teams, and therefore the differences in the kind of team development that's necessary. In the HR department of the future, the HR department of the future ought to be so smart about teams, so well versed in all the various depths and dimensions of teams, the different kinds of teams and what they need, that when the organization goes to set up a certain kind of team, the HR department will be an expert resource in what are the things that those folks are going to need in order to become effective as a team working in that area. Most of the team building stuff that I have seen is garbage, and not based on any true knowledge about what it takes for a team to function well. And so here, this is the model that you'll see on page 36 looks like this, and it's sort of I would call it a systems approach to team development, but it might also be called the car wash approach to team development. If you could imagine taking an aggregate of individuals that have some responsibility, whether they're an ad hoc group or a permanent group, whether it's a management team or some other kind of a project team or something like that, and depending on the nature of the team and the nature of the work they're meant to do, the HR department can provide modules of development, either activities the team undertakes itself that'll help them go through the early stages, and not in a kind of navel-gazing team development methodology, but in a very task-related and relationship-related approach to developing teams. So we want to find what's necessary to take this aggregate of individuals and have them become a cohesive team, more capable of doing the work that's been assigned to them. That's the kind of model that I'm looking for, and I would love for one of you folks out there to develop that.
Downsizing. Unfortunately, something I have all too much experience working in. Probably for the last 10 years, spent a lot more time working on how to perfect downsizing than how to hire somebody. But I'd like to share a typical approach to how we view downsizing. And this is what you'll find across the country, probably the most predominant flow of how we would downsize, and that is that you would first identify that there is a need to do so. And the reason for that is to decrease costs. That's typically what drives our downsizing efforts. There's an assumption that this, I'm sorry, is not in your materials. I slipped this little gem in here. So there's an assumption that there are non-contributors or that poor performers exist. We need to find out who they are, remove them from the workforce, and then, of course, the assumption is that the organization lives happily ever after, is improved in terms of capability, and so on. Again, I'd suggest that 10 years of experience has proven this model to be absolutely incorrect. But it's very difficult to let go of this. We make some erroneous assumptions. There's a company that we're currently working with who has problems with their existing performance appraisal system. And the feedback I had received is the way they hear it, the employees don't like the managers giving them the feedback, and the managers don't like giving the feedback. So the assumption is that if they just kind of remove the manager from the equation, then they can still carry on with the same kind of process they might have had. So for purposes of downsizing, what this company did was to seek out a tool where rather than using a performance evaluation from a manager that resulted in a downsizing effort, they allowed the employees to identify 10 sources of feedback. The managers identified 10 sources of feedback for the employee who were thought to be customers of this employee. The employee then is given the opportunity to eliminate 3 of those. So what we're left with now are ideally 7 people who both the manager and the employee believe would give an acceptable, have enough information to do an acceptable assessment. There then is a process and a tool that's utilized that takes every employee and puts them through a paired comparison process behind the scenes, using the feedback from the people that have been mutually agreed to. And what comes out of that, miraculously, scientifically, is a system that force ranks people from 1 to 592. And then the bottom 10% are called on the telephone, believe it or not, and told that they are in the bottom 10% and they will no longer be employed by this company. Something is wrong in our learning process, and then the company that I currently do work with, which does a lot to help companies downsize, is called in and asked to diagnose why is it that the people who are here are unhappy. They should be happy, they have a job, we need their energy, we need their attention, do something about it. The most critical learning about downsizing is to avoid the arbitrary nature of how we downsize. And to the extent possible, if you can downsize using voluntary means, or at least attempt to do that, the creativity that you can come up with is really quite tremendous. You might be able to come up with things like allowing people to grow into retirement or phase into retirement. You might actually allow people who have young children and want to pull out of the workforce, but they don't want to sever ties with you, to take a leave of absence and allow natural attrition to take over. By the time they come back, you've reduced costs. I'm being beeped. I'll be quiet. The point is, there's a whole lot of options that could be employed, and this model has been proven over and over again to create far more problems than it solves.
We had hoped to have some time at the end for questions, but that's not going to happen. But we'll be available both during this break a little bit. I do have to take a break, and also during lunch to have whatever discussions you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you.